In that book, I talk about some of the research you heard about yesterday by Willy Moskeller and Franz Edelkofer, the Reflex Project. And in that book, I already predict that the Reflex Project will be found, as it has been, to be a consistent and important piece of research. And yet we've gone a decade of the attacks on that research as an example of the war games that we saw last night in clips from the movie, Thank You for Calling, that I urge you all to watch and find. Now, in the work that we've done, we find that there are three main types of evidence that you need to look at when you are trying to develop policies concerning cell phone and other types of wireless radiation. You need to look at exposure and modeling studies. You need to look at experiments on animals and cell cultures, because every agent known to cause cancer in animals will produce it. I'm sorry, let me say that again. Every agent known to cause cancer in humans, because we have, unfortunately, dead bodies of evidence, will also produce it in animals when adequately studied. I want to repeat that. Every agent that we know for certain causes cancer in people, because we have amassed statistically significant bodies of evidence, will produce it in animals when adequately studied. That means we must listen to the animals, and we use animal research in order to predict and prevent harm, not to prove that it's already happened. That is where epidemiology comes in. Epidemiology, is this alive? Comes from two Greek words meaning epi, upon, and demos, the people. And when we have epidemiologic evidence, we have statistically significant numbers of people who have already died or become ill. That means something very important about epidemiology. It confirms the past. It can never be used to predict the future. Remember that when we're having these debates, because the technology is changing so quickly that it would be foolish for us to say, wait, where's the proof of human harm? We cannot operate a society like that, and yet we have done exactly that. We have said, show me the bodies. This cartoon expresses the approach we have taken in the past. There were warnings about asbestos in the 19th century in England. There were warnings about the dangers of tobacco as early as the 16th century and 17th century, when autopsies reported this strange accumulation of soot in the lungs of people who were not coal miners. So we were warned, and yet we insisted on proof. The only proof we accepted was dead bodies. And I hope that our society has matured enough to reject that form of proof at this time. Remains to be seen whether that's the case. Now, just a reminder, as you saw in the film last night, Thank You for Calling, this is the big, empty bowling ball into which fluid is poured to model the human brain. Now, if you shake your heads, no liquid will slosh about. And yet, this is the model that has been used to test every one of the world's 7 billion phones that's now in use. It only investigates heating. It does not take into account the smaller head size and different dielectric constant of the brain of children. And I'll get to what that dielectric constant means in just a moment. Here's what happens if you take your iPhone and you go to search on your settings, and you go all the way to General, which is there 7 down, and then you go to About at the top of the screen, and then you go to something called Legal that most of you didn't know was there. And when you click on Legal, you come to something called RF exposure, and there you have it. You've been warned. This is the information buried inside your phone that tells you that phones are tested 5 millimeters off of an adult male body. That's it. We think that's inadequate, and I will explain to you why in just a moment. Children absorb proportionally more wireless radiation than adults, and they do so because in their skull there is a bone marrow, of course, and the skull of a child is much thinner than that of an adult. You all have thick skulls. In English, to be thick-headed is not a good thing, but it is true as we grow older, we tend to get more stubborn, if we survive. But children are not little adults. They have thinner skulls, they have more fluid inside their heads, and as a consequence, the dielectric constant, the capacity of the brain of a child to absorb radiation is much greater than it is for an adult, up to 10 times greater in the bone marrow of the skull. The consequences of this are something that we will see in the next 20 years. I don't want to wait for it. In fact, I probably won't be around to see it. And that is why I'm here to talk with you today, because we know that children absorb more wireless radiation than adults, and we know from virtual reality simulations, and you can see that here, that thing in front there is to model virtual reality. How many of you have seen a virtual reality device? You understand it's emitting microwave radiation, just like a two-way microwave radio. That's how it works. It sends and receives a signal to the tower up to 900 times a minute. And this simulation, if you look at it carefully, you can see that the brain of the child gets more yellow and white, and you can see that both eyes are exposed. And obviously, to us, this is a grave matter, and it does not justify giving millions of these things out to school children around the world. I think you would no more give children a cigar and a shot of whiskey than you should give them a cell phone or a virtual reality toy. And yet, we haven't had the advertising people catch up with the reality of the science at this point.
This is why she argues phones should be tested the way we wear them. So what happens when they are? So the tests are all done.
Tests are all finished.
And?
The number exceeded the limit. It went up significantly with each one of the phones.
That's right. The phones exceeded the safety limit when they were moved right against the body. The radiation absorbed increased 3 to 4 times.
This was a test done by the Canadian Broadcast Corporation in 2017. They spent a lot of money to test these phones in an improved Federal Communications Commission laboratory, just like the phones that you may have, that your grandchildren may have. And they showed that the phones exceeded the test limit 3 to 4-fold. The Environmental Health Trust, the organization that I lead, submitted these data immediately to the Federal Communications Commission and the FDA. We still have no response. We know that most phones exceed safety limits as they are used. And we know this thanks to the work of Dr. Marco Razzi in France, who forced the French government to release their test data, and you will hear more from him later on in this conference, showing that they were able to determine that 9 out of 10 phones exceeded current limits, some by as much as 11-fold, according to Professor Om Gandhi. Now, this next clip explains to you what the Chicago Tribune did.
Still, we at the Chicago Tribune wondered, how much radiation exposure do phones really cause? We bought more than a dozen phones and had them tested by an accredited lab using standard procedures. To test each one, the lab owner used a special mixture of fluids that mimics the electrical properties of the body. He poured that into a fiberglass tub. Then he secured a phone underneath the tub and set it to operate at full power. A robotic arm dipped up and down in the fluid, measuring the amount of radiation it was absorbing. There were 2 main things we wanted to know. First, would the phones meet the safety limit if tested at the same distance from the body as the manufacturer's own testing? It turned out that some phones exceeded the limit. Next, we noticed that federal rules allow phone manufacturers to test phones up to 25 millimeters away from a simulated body. That's nearly an inch. The rules reflect times when many people carried their phones in belt clips or even holsters, not that close to the body. So our second question was, what if phones were tested at a smaller distance to reflect how people carry their phones today, like in a pocket? This is crucial. Typically, the farther away a phone is away from simulated tissue, the less exposure to radiation. So we moved the phones in closer to 2 millimeters, or less than 1/10 of an inch. At this distance, radiation exposure often exceeded the safety standard.
Yes, radiation exceeded the safety limit. In fact, they tested phones at 2 millimeter separation. Now, every single millimeter separation gives you about 15% less exposure. And because of the inverse square law, this is a substantial multiplier. So their test actually wasn't even a simulation of the real world. Because growing numbers of young people today with the tight clothing, like the pants I'm wearing, they just tuck it right in over their ovaries or right back next to the rectum. And guess what? We're seeing unusual patterns of rectal cancer now in young people. How many of you have heard of a rectal cancer case in someone under the age of 40 in the past year? We got calls last month of 4 different young women in their 30s, all diagnosed with metastatic rectal cancer. Now, we can't show what that's due to because patterns, as I indicated you, in epidemiology, we only prove the past. But if we pay attention to experimental work, we will not insist on further proof. And in fact, researchers from Iran have published a series of papers showing that colorectal cells are uniquely sensitive to radiofrequency radiation, developing reactive oxygen species, which we know to be a signal indicator of alarm in cells. And we don't want to wait for further proof of a major epidemic in young people before taking steps to warn them that when phones are tested next to the body, they exceed the current safety limits by up to 11-fold, and those safety limits are woefully out of date, as I will explain in a moment. What the Chicago Tribune test results showed is that when you test phones 2 millimeters away from the body, you exceed the US standard, which is 1.6 watts per kilogram, substantially. As a result, we have several class action lawsuits underway alleging fraudulent advertising, those ads that feature children lovingly playing with Alexa, the virtual assistant. That's absolute fraud. Those devices are tested 20 centimeters away from that big old guy that we use for the model, and do not in any way tell us what's happening to children. What we know from experimental work, which remember is used to predict and prevent harm, is that animals exposed to cell phone radiation literally develop holes in their brain. The membranes of the blood-brain barrier are weakened and breached by exposure to cell phone radiation. And we know this from numerous studies that have been done. This is a very relevant characteristic of this radiation because, among other things, it means that any toxic material to which you are exposed will be more deeply absorbed into your brain if you also have exposure to cell phone radiation and, for example, lead, as you'll see in a moment. Now, experimental studies that we have done with our colleague Claudio Fernandes at the University of Porto Alegre in Brazil, the federal university, show that when you simulate exposure of a phone in the pocket, the highest exposure goes into the testis. Watch the radiation there carefully, into the penis and the testis, where there is no bone to protect it as there is in the skull. That's the highest absorption in the human body. That is why the Cleveland Clinic says it's best to keep a phone as far away from your testis as you can. That is advice that infertility clinics around the world are giving to men. Now, I happen to disagree with my colleague Dariusz Lashinsky about whether we have sufficient evidence on damage to sperm, and I'm going to show you some of it. I'm sorry he isn't here today to see it. When you look at controlled studies of human sperm, what you find is that you can do experiments on human sperm. These are controlled experiments. You take one group of sperm in one set of test tubes, and you don't do anything to it, that's your control, and the other gets exposed to cell phone radiation for a short period of time, and look at what happens. The exposed sperm, there are fewer of them, as seen in block A, many fewer of them. Their ability to swim is definitely impeded, as seen in block B. They are poorer swimmers. That's a big problem for sperm. Do you know how far sperm have to swim? If they were human, they have to swim the equivalent of from Los Angeles to Hawaii. It's astonishing. Do you know why we need almost 500 million sperm to make one healthy baby? Because sperm do not know how to ask for directions. We do know from these studies, however, that there's clear evidence of damage. And measures of mitochondria seen in D and C are clearly impaired. There's clear damage to the mitochondria, probably from weakening of the membranes. That's one of the mechanisms that appears to be relevant here, whether it's voltage-gated calcium channels, or potassium channels, or sodium channels, or reactive oxygen species. In some sense, as Dr. Hecht said, it doesn't matter, because we know that the difference between ionizing and non-ionizing radiation may only be a question of degree, that they are not radically different in their capacity to affect our resonating human cells. Wi-Fi has been shown to interfere with human sperm. Again, aliquots of human sperm were put into petri dishes under a laptop, shielded for heat, because we know one of the many causes of sperm damage is heat. Another is tight clothing. Another is hot tubs. But here's one that shows that it's not the heat, it's the RF radiation from the laptop, clearly showing that when cells are incubated, connected to the internet for 4 hours, that's all it took. 4 hours, there was a statistically significant increase in DNA fragmentation. Pretty compelling, and I think pretty persuasive example of the kinds of evidence that you get when you're looking at experiments on human sperm. But we are already experimenting on sperm. We are already experimenting on sperm. If you carry your phone in your pocket, you're part of experiment. We are seeing increases of erectile dysfunction around the world. Viagra is one of the most popular drugs in the world. And the reason for it has to do with the continuing challenge that we face to reproductive health, for which there are many different causes. Let me be clear. They include heavy metals, alcohol, marijuana, all of which can damage sperm. But we know that cell phone radiation is an important cause of sperm damage. And we know it from controlled experimental studies on humans and from growing amounts of clinical data as well. Now, some people have questioned whether or not cell phone radiation reduces libido. But I think that there's no question that cell phone radiation can reduce libido, but also that our cultural use and dependency on these devices is clearly problematic. And I show this cartoon to you not because this is a sad problem, it's a serious problem, a very serious one. And it's growing in importance. and I think that we need to reset the way we think about such things. Now, further evidence of the capacity of cell phone radiation to damage the testis comes from research done by Ashok Agarwal, who is, in fact, the chief of the Cleveland Clinic Infertility Section and has published more than 400 peer-reviewed publications himself. And again, if you look at the exposed cells, they have nice, clear cell walls. And if you look at, the control cells on B have nice, delineated cell walls. You see the clear boundaries? And then if you look at the exposed, they have been subject to oxidative stress, protein damage, lipid peroxidation, and mitochondrial damage. And as a consequence, you see damaged sperm resulting from cell phone exposure to human male sperm. I want to stress this. In this case, we have experiments on human sperm, and unfortunately, we have data from real people too. Now, the National Toxicology Program you're going to hear more about from other colleagues, but I will just mention this. It does not simply show an increase in rare cancers of the brain. It does show that. It also shows an increase in rare cancers of the nerve in the heart. But this is what else it shows. It shows pre-neoplastic conditions in the heart. It shows cardiomyopathy. It shows pre-neoplastic conditions in the brain. It shows damage to the heart. It shows increased cancers of multiple sorts. Multiple tumors are increased. So to call this a study of only a rare cancer and say it's of no consequence, anyone to do that hasn't read the study, or certainly hasn't read the final report and may only have read the summary. But we know from this report that there's DNA damage in the COMET assay. There's damage in the hippocampus of male rats. Never underestimate the importance of the hippocampus. It's what allows you to listen to me and concentrate and have memory. And we're also seeing damage to male and female mice. So this is not a question of just a few male rats. And don't let anyone tell you that. The importance of the NTP results is it supports the IARC classification, which was reached in 2011, and the exposure intensities in the study were limited not to involve heat. Those animals were more carefully monitored than your grandmother in the nursing home. The study tested the assumption that heat could be the only effect, and it proved that assumption to be wrong. And it lays the groundwork, in my opinion, and that of many of my colleagues who are here today, to say that cell phone radiation now is a proven human carcinogen. And that is what we have concluded, not based on a religion, based on the science, based on the data. I say that I trust in God, but all others have to provide data. Now let's turn to what we know about children. There's growing literature, unfortunately, that is allowing us to tell us the results of the experiment that you and your kids and your grandkids are participating in. We know from studies of mother-child pairs that those mothers that are heaviest cell phone users have children with the highest risk of behavioral problems. It's been established in a number of studies. We know from studies of a cohort of children that those kids that start to use cell phones at age 7 themselves, and unfortunately, it's a growing number of children, they have increased rates of hyperactivity and attention deficit disorder, and they're taking drugs to deal with the illness that was caused by their using cell phones. All around the world today, in upper middle class families, cell phones have become babysitters, pacifiers. Did you know there are 10,000 apps for children between the ages of 3 months to 2 years? That there is an iPotty, that there is a teething rattle for the iPad and the iPhone, a teething rattle. And it says on the case, protect the phone from the baby. Now, we also know that screen time damages sleep because it interferes with the ability to make melatonin. Melatonin is a natural antioxidant, as most of you know, and it repairs cell damage. So if we have low levels of melatonin, we do not have the capacity to repair the damage of life, damage that comes from sunlight and oxygen and just being alive. If you're lucky, you eat well, and you don't live in a polluted zone, and you're not bombarded with too much electromagnetic field, at night, you will produce melatonin, you will repair damage. But if you've had excessive exposure to blue light from screens, and no, blue light is not just blue in color. Blue light is among the different spectrums that comes out of the screen, 440 nanometers. And if you want to improve sleep and cognition of children, get them to unplug. Research has shown in adolescents that spatial memory is impaired if they are using cell phones more. And spatial memory, again, is involving the brain region and most targeted by cell phone radiation. Interestingly, this occurs whether or not the child is talking or just having the phone. In addition, other studies have shown retarded memory and faster actions with more mistakes. Faster actions with more mistakes. Think about that the next time you're driving. With respect to children in Korea, they've been very keen to study because they were one of the early adapters of using this technology, and they have found that those with slightly elevated blood levels, just above 2.5 micrograms per deciliter, have significantly more problems with attention deficit. And they conclude that if they're mobile phone users, there's a synergistic effect, probably from the weakening of the membranes that takes place in the brain and in every cell of the human body. Now, in the Centers for Disease Control, we are seeing unexplained increases in cancer in children under age 20. We do not know why. The overall rates of brain and liver cancer have decreased, but we are seeing an increase in pediatric cancers at this same time. So when you look at cancer rates, you have to look at the younger age groups to see if we find evidence of changes in those rates. And indeed, we are seeing unexplained patterns of cancer in children. This is a recommendation from a psychiatrist I want to bring to your attention. Her book is called Reset Your Child's Brain, and it's a very elegant way to end meltdowns and restore your child's sense of self-esteem, which can be endangered by the heavy reliance on cell phones. But I want to stress this is a separate issue from the risk of cancer that we are concerned about and the damage that can take place to myelin, which is one of the many key processes involved in the growth of the young brain. Screen time can induce a hyperarousal state. Some of you may be familiar with it. You may know someone who can't go to the bathroom in the morning without taking their phone in. I noticed we were renovating a bathroom, and they're now making, I'm not making this up, they are now making toilet paper holders with a little shelf for your phone. With respect to cell towers on schools, we have data from children as well. Mobile phone base station towers are associated with a reduction in children's cognitive health and delayed fine motor skills. DNA damage has also been found with exposure to towers in a study in India where they looked at glutathione and other measures of the ability to be anti-cancer in the blood and concluded there was significant difference with those living closest to the towers. We have a Baby Safe project we developed with more than 250 obstetricians and gynecologists, and Environmental Health Trust has information for you to download and make available to your patients. So please go to our website, download our free materials, and copy them, and let us know you've done it, and put your name or your clinic on it. We also know that trees can be damaged when they are closest to mobile base stations. And this is a study that you can see if you look carefully at the crown of that tree. The crown of that tree is not well, and it is closest to where the towers are. And over a period of 20 years, unless the masts are reduced, that tree will die. I'm not going to be able to show you this video, but for those of you who are interested, you can look at our website, ehtrust.org, in the bottom left. It shows you this, what happens to honeybees exposed to cell phone radiation.
New research.
Let's go. This is one of the few studies on 5G and insects done in Switzerland, and those researchers showed that 5G millimeter waves resonate exactly with the honeybee body size. They made a prototype of the honeybee, and they indicate that you get resonance. We scientists now believe that this will disrupt the ability of these honeybees to function. All policy is like a fast-moving train. All politics are local. So we have to think globally and act locally. You see the difference here between Australia and Greece. And I leave you with information about what has been done in Berkeley. This is an ordinance that every city can pass because it simply takes that information I showed you that's buried in your phone and puts it accessible to anyone trying to buy one by giving them the right to know about the radiation in their pocket, in their device. This is what the French did. This is what my dear colleague is doing in Cyprus. This is on the back of a bus, and we translate it here in English. Don't irradiate me, learn how to protect me. This is a great public awareness campaign, and I encourage you to adopt it here. These are examples of some of the cards that I hope you will copy and make available. We have others that discuss the American Academy of Pediatrics radiation guidelines. And I won't be able to show you this video. We're going to go through it. But I will just say that there are more and more policies developing every day, which is why the fast-moving train is the right analogy. Please go to our website to get more information about what's happening around the world today. And I'm not going to... What I want you to think about is that we're not going to stop 5G right now. We need to slow it down. But we can propose limiting where it goes. There's no reason why you have to have it in your home so that your neighbor can play Words with Friends at 1 in the morning. We should let the businesses and emergency services that need the high speed and lower latency, we should let them have 5G wired to and through the premises. The fiber optic cable now in place can handle the signal. We need to limit wireless exposures solely for phone and mobile applications. And finally, I leave you with this. I don't know if many of you have seen it. It's called the Defiant Inmate. It sits inside a concentration camp, and it's life-size, not very large. And on the bottom, you see the words, Den Toten zur Ehre, den Lebenden zur Mahnung. We honor the dead to warn the living. And if we are smart, we will never make epidemiology the requirement for public policy, and we will learn to be smarter about relying on experiments on animals. Otherwise, we continue to have uncontrolled experiments on all of us. Thank you.